Just to begin by thanking you all for the invitation to CEP for organising, and to send apologies from the first author of the UK chapter, Graham Macklin, who may not be able to join us today. But the presentation today will give an overview and outlook on the situation here in the United Kingdom. And within that, we're going to look at the legal and policy framework around right-wing extremism. We're going to look at the background to the rise of the violent extremist and terrorist groups. We're going to look at the transnational linkages of those groups, some of which have already been mentioned, and look at preventative efforts in the UK, again, which we've already heard our opening speakers discuss, and also to conclude by a brief outlook stressing the challenges and opportunities that are currently facing this movement. So to briefly begin, the legislative and policy framework around right-wing extremism in the United Kingdom. Terrorism in the UK is not differentiated by type of concern in the legislation. So the Terrorism Act doesn't define a specific offence of right-wing terrorism, but that's not to say that policymakers and the policy community and the political community are unaware of or lack of knowledge about what right-wing extremism is. So if we look at the contest strategy, the UK's counter-terrorism strategy, it identifies right-wing extremism as being those people who share the racist view that minority communities are harmful to the interests of, quote, a native population. And the UK's counter-extremism strategy of 2015 also defines right-wing extremism as those people who have a core hatred of minorities, or those who seek to promote Islamophobic or anti-Semitic views. And there's also a very clear recognition that within that there lies the replacement narratives, and we've already heard discussion of the Great Replacement Theory in today's session already. So there's a very keen awareness, we would say, in the policy community about what right-wing extremism is, despite the fact that there's no specific offence of right-wing terrorism. So the focus of the presentation today will be those prescribed organisations, those prescribed terrorist groups, and we've already heard discussion of the primary one, national action, in the earlier part of the discussion. But how did we get to the scenario that we have today from around the 2015 to 2020 period? Well, traditionally, the history of British right-wing extremism is a very long one, and there have been various groups which have enjoyed various degrees of success for many decades. But in more recent times, the context which has led to the rise of groups like National Action can be linked back to, for example, the collapse in the electoral fortunes of the British National Party, which enjoyed a brief period of success during the 2000s. And in its wake, the collapse of the BNP brought with it also the collapse of prominent anti-Muslim street protest scene, exemplified by groups such as the English Defence League. So these alternative outlets for right-wing extremism were starting to collapse or implode at this time. Britain First is another fairly notorious right-wing group which emerges in the 2010s and attracts a lot of controversy because of its controversial mosque invasions, and attracts a lot of publicity at various points in its operation. But there's no real breakthrough either electorally or in terms of the impact that it sought to make. And it, if you like, dissipates in fairly acrimonious circumstances as well. But it's this context that leads to the emergence of National Action in 2013. And National Action was a challenge because it created a network threat that hadn't been seen since the rise of, for example, Combat 18 in the 1990s. So with the rise of National Action, you now have a network threat and a real, more extreme group than had been seen for some time. Now, as we can see from the list of prescribed right-wing organisations in the United Kingdom, National Action, which was banned in 2016, had a number of aliases and a number of names which were seen as synonymous with the group. The organisation Scottish Dawn, National Socialist Anti-Capitalist Action, and the System Resistance Network. Now, National Action emerges, if you like, it's very popular, not very popular, but emerges in the UK campus scene, and it attracts a lot of controversy there. It's banned in 2016 following the murder of Joe Cox MP, and some of the group's activity on social media brings it to the attention of the then Home Secretary. Other groups which have been prescribed in the United Kingdom in 2020 include the Sun and Creek Division and the Fire Creek Division, groups which again have a transnational element to them, and a very significant online presence, or at least they had for a period of time. FKD apparently has claimed that it was dissolving, but the Home Office begged to differ on that front. And these groups are classified in the prescription documentation as having a neo-Nazi or white supremacist anti-minority outlook. So, you know, pretty extreme when it comes to the outlook of the groups. In terms of their composition, and this is something that has been written about, we're talking about mostly male dominated. When it comes to those groups that do have an offline presence, often self-financed when it comes to their activities, but primarily active online. National Action probably was a bit different in this respect, as it had an online and offline presence. FKD was involved in the distribution of some propaganda offline, but again, a lot of that activity was online and linked into other groups elsewhere. And that brings us to the transnational connections. Particularly with National Action, we see a great deal of activity and attempts to link up with like-minded groups on the continent. So we have links with Polish activists, and a number of Polish operatives had a presence at street demonstrations in the United Kingdom, at which National Action were involved. Interestingly, for a British far-right group, it had a pro-Ukrainian rather than pro-Russian stance, and therefore the Azov division and the Azov movement was very much a source of inspiration to it. And it's been reported that there were reciprocal visits between some of the National Action leaders and the Azov brigade, and that the Azov movement had dispatched somebody to London or the United Kingdom, but was not necessarily impressed with NA. There were also visits to the Nordic resistance movement in Finland and Sweden, and attendance of some of those involved with National Action at commemorative events involving the far right in Latvia and Lithuania, and reports of reciprocal visits between Lithuanian activists and those from National Action. In terms of ideology and ideas, there's definitely ideological connections that we can see between British and US white supremacists, and some United Kingdom groups had modeled themselves on their US counterparts. For example, the Sun and Creek Division, as we've heard, draws inspiration from groups such as the Adam Baffin Division in the United States. In terms of the non-prescribed groups, there have also been links between British-based groups and those in the Balkans, for example, and transnational connections there, reciprocal visits, provision of support, and so on. So this is a movement which is, as the report stresses, united by travel, united by ideology. Preventative efforts. Well, we've already heard in the opening remarks of Ms. Michael, the fact that the United Kingdom has a number of high-profile policies to counter extremism of all sorts. The best known is probably the PREVENT strategy. Since 2011, the PREVENT strategy gives equal priority to right-wing and Islamist extremisms. And PREVENT focuses on vulnerability to radicalization. And we can see, certainly in some of the trends in the United Kingdom, many of those who had been recently brought up by the authorities for right-wing or alleged right-wing activity have been quite young and from perhaps quite troubled backgrounds. So this focus on these vulnerabilities could be quite useful in capturing some of those individuals before they become too far imbued in that ideology. Whether or not it captures all those who become involved in the scene, those who are maybe not quite so vulnerable, those who maybe come from a more a background which is more steeped in this sort of violent activity, is another matter, and perhaps a combination of this approach with more hard-edge counter-terrorism might be a useful approach here. Coupled with Prevent then is the Channel program, and that is a voluntary de-radicalization program. It's multi-agency and it's based around safeguarding, again, those vulnerable individuals and identifying support for them where necessary. The UK takes a whole of society approach, broadly speaking, to counter-radicalization, exemplified in the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act and the Prevent duty, which is part of that legislation, which brings a duty of due regard on a range of public institutions to take due regard of individuals who may be drawn to terrorism. Covers a range of bodies from universities through schools through the health service. And when it comes to preventative measures, practitioners are also very keenly aware of and serious about non-violent extremism or ideology. It's not just the violence that people are focused on. There's an awareness that people can become drawn into this kind of activity or engage in it through initial engagement with non-violent extremist ideology, which may or may not have this kind of racial or ethnically motivated edge to it. What do the trends look like? Well, we've already had some comment on that in the opening remarks. We're seeing relatively low number of terror attacks and plots, but the trend in recent years had been rising. Some racially and ethnically motivated incidents have also been prosecuted under other statutes, so not all of the offences that we see are prosecuted as terrorism. There have been a vehicular attack, for example, that was prosecuted simply as dangerous driving, but the facts of the case suggested a clear racially and ethnically motivated background to it. We also saw the statistics somewhat, if you like, inflated by the banning of national action, and the prescription of that group saw a big increase in both arrests for alleged extreme right-wing activity and convictions for membership of the prescribed organisation. And in recent years as well, the Prevent cases regarding far-right referrals have been increasing, along with cases in channel adopted for channel support. So not every Prevent referral results in a channel case being adopted, but we have seen a rise, as has already been mentioned, in recent years. And we'll just give you a brief statistical snapshot here. We can see over the period 2015 to 2020, quite a significant rise in those cases adopted for channel support by type of concern. And we look at the second column, we can see that right-wing extremism has been numerically quite the highest number in recent years, holding steady in terms of its percentage of the overall number of cases adopted. So, to conclude, what are the outlook and the opportunities and challenges for this movement or milieu in the United Kingdom? Well, when it comes to opportunities, the current pandemic certainly seems to be an opportunity for the extreme right. Conspiratorial rhetoric is certainly thriving during the pandemic, and there are, we can see extreme right and radical right groups active in anti-lockdown movements and various other conspiratorial operations, anti-vaccine propaganda and so on. The potential for an economic downturn, especially after the restrictions are eased, is also another cause of concern. If there was to be mass unemployment or such like, there would be concerns that people could be drawn into extremist activity or criminal activity of some other sort. Potential unrest in Northern Ireland, and this is a conflict and an issue that hasn't necessarily gone away. And in recent times, we've seen various unsettling news coming from that region. Although it has to be said that the far right often try to capitalise on unrest in Northern Ireland, but to date they haven't had a great deal of success in that respect, primarily because many of those who in the region have a more far left economic outlook, and the far right doesn't necessarily have that great an appeal. But when it comes to challenges, there are also quite a few significant challenges for the far right. There's much greater public awareness of the issue, reflected in things like referrals to the Prevent programme, much greater scrutiny of the online sphere, particularly by civil society organisations, NGOs, think tanks, and law enforcement. The internal cohesion of the groups and their capacity to carry out violent attacks is also something that should be noted. Often, the groups lack internal cohesion or capacity of inspired individuals to cause harm, and perhaps most crucially, a much more hostile environment, greater scrutiny from the police and the security services. MI5 leading on far-right extremism will create a much more difficult climate for these groups in the future. So for all sorts of reasons, perhaps we're unlikely to see scenes like we witnessed on last month in the United States, in the United Kingdom, anytime soon. And that is probably an ideal point to end the presentation and to hand over to my colleague Joshua to discuss that very situation.